Welcome to another episode of Cutting Edge Health. And today we're talking about, is depression genetic? What the research says and how it impacts best treatment. If we haven't met, I'm Dr. Orlando Landrum. I'm help patients understand what their options are and how to be able to punch pain in the face, whether it's physical pain or whether it's mental pain, and how to get back to leading the life you deserve. So today we're talking about, is depression genetic? And for those of you who haven't had that question, if you've had some degree of depression, you're probably a little bit unusual and atypical, because most people are like, man, is this coming from somewhere? Is it from my parents? Is it from other people? How did I get this? And is this something that's just unique to me? So we're going to answer that question, and we're going to give you kind of like the insight and background behind it. To do that, we're going to use a number of different articles like we always do, so it's not just my opinion, which is one of the things that frustrates me most when I look at YouTube. Sometimes we see different doctors talking about what it is that they believe is the case, and they don't provide any science behind it. So on this channel, we don't do that. We give you actually the references so you can see it for yourself, so you can go back at a later point in time and identify it. So we're going to talk about a number of different papers, and we're going to give you these titles right off the bat. The first title is Longitudinal Early Epigenomics Signatures Inform Molecular Paths of Therapy Response in Remission in Depressed Patients. I know we got fancy titles. I get it. Bear with me. We're going to explain it and break it down. Second paper, Genetics and Major Depressive Disorder, Clinical Implications for Disease, Risk, and Prognosis. Third paper, Genetic Variables of the Glutamatergic System Associated with Treatment-Resistant Depression. And then finally, we're going to talk about Major Depressive Disorder, Hypotheses, Mechanism, Prevention, and Treatment. So I know all of that is super fancy, and I know it's very sciencey. However, we are going to explain it, and we're going to use a lot of pictorial representations and then give you the explanation behind how all of it works. So let's take a step back for a second and talk about depression as a whole. So when we think about depression, depression itself seems like it's self-explanatory, but it's not just a depressed mood. Sometimes it's loss of interest. Sometimes it's changes in weight or appetite. Sometimes it's an increased likelihood of self-harm. And so that's how it's really kind of classified. And so when we look at this, major depressive disorder has been associated with genes for some time. There's a number of different tests that look at kind of the genetic ability to be able to assess. However, it's actually more complicated than what you might think. So when we look at disease risk and genetic vulnerability, there's some degree of genomic research that has been done to really evaluate this. And what we see is that it's based on different pathways, because there's not just one pathway for the aspect and evaluation or expression of depression. So what we see is that there are different pathways, and those pathways have different genetic components to them. And so accordingly, we need to be able to assess what those pathways look like. So when we say pathways, what the heck does that mean? Let me explain it to you in just a minute or so. So the challenge is there are different risks that are associated for different people. And what we see is that there's genetic predictors and there's clinical predictors, and they are not just one and the same. So it's a mixture of both. So when we look at these different pathways, for instance, we can see one aspect is looking at something that's called astrocytes. And these are cells that surround and are involved with neuronal activation and utilization. So when you look at this, we can see that there's a whole host of different molecules. At the top component, there is the cell membrane. And outside of it, in this purple component, we could see this medication is called fluoxetine, which is a depressive type medication. That actually has an impact on a traditional glutamate system. And that's what this is showing, where we have various different molecules. After being able to be triggered through a channel, it activates things. And then these activations is what can result in depression. So let's take a step back for a second. What are some of these different elements that can cause depression? So if you go from the clock starting around 9 o'clock or so and go around in a clockwise fashion, what you can see is there's something that's called the HPA axis, and that's where you look at the hypothalamus, how it connects to the pituitary and adrenal. Secondarily, at 12 o'clock is this monoamine hypothesis, which looks at serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. To the areas of around 2 to 3 o'clock, you can see this inflammatory hypothesis that looks at things like interleukin 1B and tumor necrosis alpha. And I know I'm using a lot of fancy terms, but I want you to understand that those headings are the different pathways that we're talking about. And so when we come down to this other area that looks like genetic and epigenetic anomalies, this is the area that we're looking at that can be that component of different structures that are influenced. And then you can have structural and functional brain remodeling. So things where you have changes in the hippocampus or the amygdala. And finally, you can have the social psychological hypothesis where you have stress and traumatic events. So when we look at the genetic areas, like we mentioned before, with things like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, one of these pathways is this, which I know is a lot of stuff going on. But in essence, this is dealing with something that's called a cytokine, which we've talked about for some of our regenerative medicine before. But in essence, it's that inflammatory component that has a number of different issues that come up. And you can see that there are things like the SSRIs and tricyclic antidepressants that use this in order to be able to try to attempt to stop depression. And you can see it's way more complicated than what we expected. We see that there's molecules that are activated because of these channels, and we see things that can be able to make it worse. So things like sleep deprivation or damage, like ischemic damage, where you have problems with blood flow or oxygenation or oxidative stress, can cause increased or upregulation of molecules that are present within the pathway. At the same time, we can see neuronal impairments, or as we mentioned before, that astrocyte, which is in and around the neuronal. We can see that there's changes that are present, and it results at this very bottom component of this graph, depressive-like behaviors. And so what we've been able to determine is that there are pathways that have genetic portions of these molecules that are present either in the membrane or in the aspects of the cells that are associated with certain genes. So for instance, when we take a look at this picture, what we can see is the areas of a nerve cell. So we have this synapse, or where you have one portion of the nerve that's present as the presynaptic, or the area that has these release, the top portion on this right-hand side, and the bottom portion, which is this postsynaptic area. And then on each side, one in yellow, which is the astrocyte, and off to the left-hand side, the microglia, areas that influence the nerve and how the nerve functions. If you can see on this area around the presynaptic, or the top component of the blue, you see listed TCAs, SSRIs, and SNRIs, which are traditional antidepressant type medications. And they have effects on things like serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, glutamate, GABA, and all those things have channels that are present on the postsynaptic side. So what we can be able to determine is that there are challenges that are associated with genes that impact those things specifically. So what we've been able to see is that depression as a whole, it's a mix, is what a heterogeneous disease is. There's components that are influential, like SSRIs and SNRIs as first-line treatments, but a good number of patients don't necessarily respond to them. About 30% don't respond, and there's a reason for that. And what we think those reasons are is that it may be secondary to genetic components. So when we look at other pathways like this one, which looks at that presynaptic area, and it looks at specifically how TCAs, or tricyclic antidepressants, impact various different components of the presynaptic neuron, the one above, and how they can impact how there's various different measures of how this influences depression as we kind of go down. So what are the things that we can do to change whether genetics actually causes us a problem or not? So this is how we can be able to impact better treatment. So one is to be able to improve overall sleep. And so why is that important? Because it changes the way things are with how enzymes work and how there's an aspect of the way the cognitive component connects. We can have dietary adjustments, which influence the way the gut microbiome brain axis connects, and it changes how inflammation is present, one of that original circle that's in place. We can have social intervention, which is able to improve self-awareness and emotional support. And we can have exercise, which improves neuroplasticity, which we've talked about before, is how the neurons connect and how they talk. So sometimes we can be able to basically get around the limitations that we may have with that presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron and how those channels are influenced potentially by genetics. In addition, there's some other ways to be able to look at this. So major depressive disorder, which is MDD, is connected with several cellular and structural modifications in the nervous system. But what we can't always identify is how well does that happen in the actual person. So there's another system which is associated with treatment-resistant depression, which is TRD. And that is the system that focuses on glutamate and specifically the NMDA receptor. And so that receptor is one of the receptors that's responsive to things like ketamine or esketamine, like Spravato is the other name for it. And treating it can be able to give improvements that are independent of the serotonin, the aspects of things like dopamine and other items of that issue. And it's one of the reasons why TMS can also be a value, transcranial magnetic stimulation, because it's not necessarily dependent upon those specific receptors. So although depression can impact receptor, it can impact neuronal function, it doesn't impact all pathways the same. One, it doesn't impact every person the same way. And it's not a sentence to not being able to have some degree of treatment that can improve, because there's ways to work around the traditional chemical pathways by using different other treatments that aren't typically susceptible to the same type of genetic predisposition. So things like the NMDA and glutamate system can be utilized by doing things like ketamine and esketamine, or being able to have the brain and talk together, you can get an improvement as well for depression that traditionally isn't responsive. So at the end of the day, is depression genetic? Sometimes it can be, but is it always going to influence the way that you can be able to improve? No. So hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please hit the like button. If you have questions about this video or comments, please leave them in the comment section. And we appreciate you joining. And if there's other things that you want to know about, please hit the subscribe button, because we'd love to be able to help you understand your options and how to be able to punch pain in the face and get back to leading the life you deserve. Thank you so much and have a great day.